Hey, it's Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. And in a few minutes, you're going to watch an interview, assuming you don't click away, of course. In a few minutes, you are going to watch an interview between myself and the designers of Bardsung. We talked a bit about the game, we talked a bit about the history of the game, and then at the end of that video, I will tell you why I am choosing to back Bardsung. And part of that will evolve throughout the course of the video. Part of that will be because I had a gameplay experience of a boss battle in the game, which is the first time I've gotten to actually play Bardsung. And there will be a link separately to that gameplay. In order to make this video somewhat palatable in its length, I will not be including the gameplay in this. Rather, there will be a link down below to me having a boss battle. I will have a separate intro to that video as well, giving you a quick overview of what you're seeing so you can follow the action as best you can, or be as involved as you can. It is a gameplay video by Board Game Co. So understand, this is no heavily edited masterpiece of camera angles and everything else. There's a reason it will be an unlisted video accessible only by a link. But that is basically the short intro. I hope you enjoy the interview. Again, timestamps down below for everything. There will be a gameplay video separately, and then at the end of this interview, I will be going into why I am choosing to back Bardsung when I have very much been on the fence for, well, the past 2 weeks. Enjoy the interview, and I will see you on the other side. Hello everyone, I am Alex from Board Game Co., and today I am joined by Matt and Sherwin from Steamforged Games. Matt, Sherwin, say hi to everyone.
Hi everyone, how you doing?
Yeah, so basically, Steamforged Games was kind enough to reach out to me basically after the videos I've done already on Bardsung, because I am, well, if you've been watching my Bardsung content already, then you already know that I am simultaneously incredibly interested in this game and also overwhelmed with dungeon crawlers, campaign games, and other things, which puts this in a very tricky spot of, is it the game that's right for me? Is it a game that's going to push me over? And so this is almost like a bit of a conversation about Bardsung in general, as well as the specific concerns I have for myself, not for the game in general, and just turning it into a full-on conversation and seeing how this plays out. And so basically, to begin with, I guess let's start with fluff stuff or whatnot, background or whatnot. But you guys, Steamforged Games has had two of your own unique IP games, God Tier and now Bardsung, at least to the best of my knowledge. If I'm wrong about anything, obviously correct me. And then a whole bunch of IP games. So I'm curious, what is the decision process, or what happens over there at your company, warehouse, whatever, not warehouse, building, whatever it is, in terms of that decision process? How do you go through that product development cycle and decide IP, decide, your own game or whatever it is?
So we do have an additional original IP that we started the company with, which is a miniatures game called Guild Ball.
Oh, Guild Ball. Yeah, I know about Guild Ball. That's my bad. Yes. So
Bardsung is our third kind of big original IP. I think there's been a few other sort of smaller games that we've done for fun, and like Shadow Games is one that springs to mind. The process we go through in terms of determining what projects we take on and those that we choose to leave on the table, as it were, involves quite a lot of different variables. There's opportunity, which is the opportunity for, would this game be right for the market? Would this game be right? What kind of players would this game appeal to? Do we have access to those kinds of players? Are they interested in Steamforged doing that kind of game for them? Are all things that we think about. So a good example would be, we've often talked about doing a trading card game, but we haven't done a trading card game to date. So that is a fairly tall order when you're trying to write a business case for why we should do a trading card game. We don't have any chops in that. I mean, we all play trading card games and we're all kind of huge fans of it, and we believe that we could make a cracking game.
Sure.
But do we have an audience who would associate us with that? Not so much. So we would think about those kinds of positioning style questions. We would obviously think about what opportunities do we actually have, and we're lucky enough to have really close ties with Sony and Microsoft and Capcom and Namco and all the other sort of big AAA publishers that you would associate with video game land. So we're in constant conversations with them about different IPs. And one of the things that we said from the very beginning is, we're not a white box company. So we're not going to take a game, slap that skin onto a white box game and just shove it out the door and make a bit of money on it.
Okay.
We treat licensed IP with the same degree of care and attention as we would an original IP. So for us, once a game actually goes into our design and development process, it's almost indistinguishable. It's just with a licensed IP, you do need to get someone else to sign off, whereas with an original IP, you have a lot more freedom to sign off your own stuff. And with a licensed IP, you tend to have a whole bunch of artwork at the beginning of the project, but it might not always be the kind of artwork that you need or want. Whereas with an original IP, you kind of need to create the artwork that you want or need for the project. So there's, you know, they're very similar beasts. They follow a very similar development cycle, but some are better suited to some of our development team and than others. So we also have a look, and this is the other variable we look at, is who in the team is up, who's got time, who's got bandwidth, what are we currently working on, what games are we releasing. We don't obviously want to cannibalize our own sales. We don't want to compete head to head with other companies that are coming out with similar projects at the same sort of time.
Sure.
And you know, there's a huge network of game developers and publishers, you know, sort of behind the scenes. So we're in conversations with people because, you know, we don't want to tread on each other's toes. We're all friends at the end of the day. We meet up at shows and at conventions, and we all hang out in our tiny little sort of 6x6 cubicles hidden away from the show floor. But, you know, that's how the world works, isn't it? So there's quite a lot of things that we think about, but the really simple elevator pitch is there are two aspects to Steamforge's business model. And one is licensed IP and bringing the very best quality licensed products that we can to the market that actually have a meaningful experience that will resonate with fans of that IP. We look to enhance the IP that we work with. And original IP is we look to bring original, refreshing takes of new content that will bring, you know, fans to this Steamforged kind of creative process. That's what we're looking to do, and they're both equally important to us. They might have different responsibilities when it comes to like revenue forecasting for obvious reasons.
Sure, of course.
But they are equally important in terms of overall strategy and intent of the business.
Sure. And then for Bardsung specifically, like, what was the design process that looked like? I mean, not the design itself. Sorry, what was the origination? Like, you sat there and said, someone's gonna make a dungeon crawler here, which, I mean, so someone's gonna make a dungeon crawler. What's the theme? You know, what do we want? What space are we trying to be in? Like, how was Bardsung itself born?
So Bardsung, like a lot of projects, was initially defined by the negative space that we attach to other products in that genre. Mm-hmm. So what are the things that we found frustrating about some of the games that we actually liked and enjoyed playing? You know, and all the usual suspects are there. So I don't need to kind of rattle through them. I'm not kind of particularly want to specifically name games, but the usual suspects in the dungeon exploring genre, we all play them and we play them a lot. And there are things about them that we are keen on, and there are things about them that we're not keen on. And we're always, as designers, looking at, well, why is that experience not as strong as it could be? And how would we do it differently? And what would a game look like if we were able to, for example, spend more time in the exploration pillar and feel like you're actually exploring a dungeon rather than seeing it all laid out in front of you and all the bad guys are already out on the board in front of you? And why am I spending 25 minutes setting up this game to actually spoil the experience for me completely when I could be set up and playing within a couple of minutes and then getting that sense of exploration as I go through the dungeon? Well, that's a different spin, and that's bringing something new to the genre. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that every concept in Bardsung is purely original. It's not.
It doesn't have to be. I mean, every dungeon crawler is going to inherently have overlap, but there's different. Every one will also bring its own spin to the table, something that makes it a reason you might pick that one over another. The accessibility of Bardsung from day one of the campaign has clearly been a selling point, but it also comes with the concern that perhaps it's and we can touch upon this a little bit later, but it comes with the concern that how accessible. How to phrase this? Is the accessibility coming at the cost of depth and strategy and all of that? That's going to be another aspect that I do want to touch upon at some point shortly. But yeah, it doesn't have to stand out completely. It just has to do something. It has to do something that people like, and then do it differently enough that people are like, well, I want to pick up that one. Yes,
no, absolutely. And one of the analogies that I do particularly enjoy is it's the difference between a Renaissance piece of work and the same work during the Industrial Revolution. So it's it's having enough elements of Renaissance, i.e. having a new idea or a new fresh take on something, but then recognizing that putting it through an industrial process or putting it through our creative process polishes it and hones it and refines it and pulls it all together to create a unique proposition. And it's not going to be for everyone. And Sherwin and I are absolutely not here to try and hoodwink people in or pretend it's something that isn't. It is what it is. It's a brilliant game if that appeals to you, and if it doesn't appeal to you, then we really don't want to try and convince you to come in and play the game, because you might end up being an unhappy customer. I'd rather have you as a future customer for another project, so we're here just to say, hey, this is Bardsung and this is what it is, and it is that kind of just circling back to the original question, is that game that came about from a lot of things that we loved about Dungeon Explorers and a lot of things that we disliked about them, and how can we address those differences?
Yeah, and I think something where, what have we learned in the process of making various different other titles as well that we can layer into that as well. So it's not necessarily just sort of identifying. For example, it's one of our very early conversations we had with regards to Bardsung was we talked about how we wanted to keep a forward momentum, the forward pressure on the party, and we looked at what we've done with some of the other games we've made, such as Resident Evil, and went, well, how did we achieve that in that game? What made that so enthralling to players? What did they really enjoy about that game? And could we put that into Bardsung? And ultimately, we didn't end up using the tension deck. That ended up evolving and changing a little bit into the Wandering Monster system for Bardsung. But
interesting.
It's a really good indication of how we can sort of, we approach these things from several different viewpoints, depending on who's involved with it. And obviously we canvas lots of dev teams kind of discussion points about, what do we like about games? And we sort of fold that into it as well.
And so specifically with Bardsung, to someone, you mentioned, Matt, you mentioned being the right fit for the right person. What specifically would you say are however many, whether it's 2, 3, 4, what are the main points that you think might make Bardsung something that is appealing to someone else as a dungeon crawler? What are the selling points of it in the dungeon crawler ecosystem?
I think it's... that's a good question, and I wish I'd written down a pre-prepared answer.
We can come back to it if you want to think about it.
No, that's fine. I'll try and freeform jazz it a little bit, and then Sherwin will fill in any obvious gaps I've left behind, which is how we roll. So I think one of the key things to look at is that sense of exploration. And I think it's so fundamentally important to the Bardsung experience. And it's, I've seen it in other games, but I haven't got the same sense that I look back at a dungeon and I can remember a story that was built as a result of the dungeon that we explored. That time where the earthquake shut off all the exits just as we were about to cross over the line. We had to reroute around, deal with a wandering monster, wade through the water trap that that Sherwin had set off and we failed to deal with properly. And then right at the very end, on the very stairs leading down to the next dungeon, the hobgoblin ambush kind of triggered and we had that big fight. Well, Bardsung delivers that, and I don't know if I've ever experienced a sense of surprise and like these kind of narrative kind of connective points that allow me to tell a story as often and as strongly as we get from Bardsung in any other Dungeon Explorer. And I feel like a lot of other Dungeon Explorers that are quite heavily narrative and campaign based, it's quite constrained. This is the beginning of this dungeon. And at the end, we're going to tell you what the ending is, and you just see if you can get through our perfectly balanced dungeon. And if you're efficient with your move economy and you get the right dice rolls, and you're going to get to the end success, you can move on to the next part of the campaign. And I feel like I'm almost like detached.
I totally hear that. I mean, some of my favorite, I always feel a little bit self-conscious when I say this. When people ask me about my favorite dungeon crawlers, I often want to say Zombicide Black Plague because of that story aspect. It has that craziness built in. It's not a finely tuned Gloomhaven or whatever. It is craziness. You just get overwhelmed and then have these moments where you're like, and remember that time. And I totally, that resonates with me. I totally hear that. Okay, so that would be the sense of exploration.
So that's one or 2 points. Building off of that then is really a sense of player agency. So keeping the goal simple for the procedural part of the game. You want to get from point A to point B. It's really easy. It's really accessible for players of all skill and experience, right? But we then throw you curveballs. We throw you stuff out in the fog of war. Do you now choose to try and go out for that, knowing it's going to make your life harder, knowing that you're choosing to deviate from the straight path? Or is that the way the dungeon pushes you? And I think that gives you an extra nuance to the exploration, because it is a game about player agency. And when you look at the way we structure the adventures, and they are those node diagrams, you can choose how you try and get to the end. You know, we've put a sample adventure in the rulebook that's up on the page, and it's the Crimson Hook adventure. Well, there's multiple ways to get to Crimson Hook. You know, there's a short route. You can literally just go fast track there, but you need to make sure you're trying to uncover every lost treasure along the way and hoping you find the key to get, get the drop for the key, so you can open like the Crimson Hook's final room and then go in and fight her. Or you can go the long way around, or you can try it on the risky route, realize you're going to fail, and then use a secret passageway to get to another place. And then again, we're trying to tempt you off to, hey, there's a little treasure room over here, there's a few bits and pieces over here. So it's up to you. And this is inherent in the way you choose your own adventure through the campaign, and the way that the narrative reacts to the directions you choose to go in. And so we have a really broad spectrum story that we're telling, that you can only truly experience if you go multiple routes through the game,
sure.
To get that overall sense. And that really ties back to one of the more influential TV shows, I think, for a lot of people. So I'm not special, but The Wire. And the reason why I love The Wire was it talked about the same story, but from so many different lenses, that it gave you such a wonderful kind of balanced view on what was going on, in this situation. And I feel like Bardsung, the writing is excellent, but I don't know if it's going to be like on the par with The Wire, but we're going to try. But it's if you go down the route where you're trying to exterminate the hobgoblins, do you go down a route where you're trying to get the hobgoblins to kind of go into a bit of a civil war with the bugbears? Do you actually bypass them altogether and try and get lower levels?
I need to pause and interrupt that. You just mentioned the hobgoblins having a civil war with the bugbears. How does that play out?
How does that play out? Well, it's the route that you choose. So the game will react to how you're playing through. So
sure.
The types of encounters that you'll come across, and the way that they are orientated, and the way that their intent is set out. So if you are able to, follow a route where you're kind of creating a situation where the bugbears are going up against the hobgoblins, well, then you're going to start coming across rooms that have littered corpses in them. Maybe you've got a clear run through, but maybe there's a large, now you've got a big wandering monster problem that have been attracted by the smell of blood. So now the dungeons you're going through tend to be, more big monster focused. There's so many different routes through this campaign that will give you a different spin. And so this is the third point, maybe even fourth or fifth point. I don't know how many are bundling into these bullet points.
I do the same thing on all my videos. I start counting. I'm like, I'm up to point 17. It's all good. We'll figure it out. But yeah, go ahead.
So out of the box, you lift the control tray out, and that has like the room and the corridor decks, and it has the aspect cards for like combat and challenges. It has the vault cards and the tokens, blah blah blah. You've got your room token, your room tray, your character trays all go out, and then at the bottom your monsters and your bad guys are all ready to rock and roll. So you're often playing, and you're going through, and each time you go into a new adventure, i.e. you take a different route through the story, you're modifying the cards that are in the room and the corridor deck and the aspect decks. So a good example is if you choose to go down the bugbear route, well, we're going to start seeding in more bugbear style encounters into those rooms and corridors that you're going to be making your way through, because you're going through bugbear territory. We're also going to seed in opportunities for you to kind of role play, not in the truest D&D kind of sense, but certainly in the sense that you're doing more than just running into a room and killing something. Do you choose to talk to the bugbear shaman? If so, he's going to give you a token. That token's going to trigger something else later on in the campaign. Might be good, might be bad, might be indifferent. Depends on the choices you make as you go through. So the game's able to track variables through your adventures, and those variables will have meaning and have impact on the endings that we start to generate as you get into the third act of the story.
It's so interesting. This is an entire aspect of the game. Like, I know the game on a fairly surface level. I've read every single update. I've looked at the campaign, but there's whole aspects here that I'm just totally not aware of, which is great. You're pushing me. But
it's I think part of my kind of intent is like I want I want to tell you what the game is without pushing you, but I feel like there's so many cool things that are worth kind of talking about. So bear in mind, I don't know how well it translates across to the into the States, but we have Ian Livingstone on board. Ian Livingstone is one of the founders of Games Workshop, but he's probably best known for his series of fighting fantasy books, which has just celebrated its like 25th or 30th year anniversary. He sold 200 million books around the world, you know, of these choose your own adventure books. And I grew up on them when I was a kid. That was how I got my fantasy kicks, you know, from Warlock of Fire to a Mountain, or you know, and through. Sure. But when you get to sit down and talk to Ian and understand how he structures these stories that have such a compelling lure to readers to keep coming back book after book after book, and you see how you can tell these different stories and how the book can feel depending on choices of going left or right, or choosing to do a good thing or a bad thing, or you know, a little bit more ambiguity in the middle, and then how he controls the narrative going down. Well, all of that knowledge has been built into the Bardsung campaign system. And then on top of that, we've got Rhianna Pratchett, who is just released the latest fighting fantasy book. She's worked with Ian most recently, but she is a fresh, young, new writer, and well, I mean, with huge experience. And she's taken the mantle. So you've got the godfather of Choose Your Own Adventures and the heir apparent of Choose Your Own Adventures working with us on the overall campaign. So the campaign is the hardest thing for us to show at Kickstarter, because we don't want to spoil it. We don't, and the only way we're able to really kind of demonstrate it to you is by showing it to you and spoiling it, which we just don't want to do. So it's more important for us to focus on, look at who we've got involved helping us write this game and craft this big overarching campaign narrative, and then imagine being able to go through that multiple different ways and feeling like your choices are making impact every single step of the way.
Gotcha. Now, that's actually helpful. So I think the point I might have misconstrued along the way is you're saying they are working with you more on the overall story of the game, meaning as opposed to being a guest writer.
So Ian is behind the scenes helping us structure the campaign.
Gotcha.
Rhianna is our lead narrative in that regard. So
Gotcha.
She is on the project for the campaign story and how that works. Ian will do a guest adventure. I believe he's going to do a Bardsung version of the very first dungeon that he ever designed and published in Dragon magazine, or whatever it was, White Dwarf, I think it was back then. So we're going to have a reimagining of that. So that's going to be quite cool to do. But all the other guys and girls who are involved in as guest writers, they are ostensibly going to be working on individual dungeon experiences, which can be played as standalone one-shots, if you like. So if you and your gaming buddies want to get together and just do a one-shot, grab that, off you go. Or we're going to work with Rhianna to take those adventures and see if we can weave them into the overarching campaign as little side quests. And there'll be little bits of Easter egg information in there that will help refer you back to the overall campaign picture. So it's well worth going down those side quests if you want to get that big, I see everything kind of view of the story that we're telling.
And I think it's a good idea, because like, speaking for myself, one of the things that I was actually more pulled in by is the idea of the one-shot adventures, not because I don't love campaigns, but because I have a lot of games, and sometimes campaigns are hard to pull out consistently.
Yeah,
so for
right.
me, I find that what I do is I'll play a one-shot. Let's say Gloomhaven's a great example. I've played like 3 missions of Gloomhaven, just enough to see if it's a game for me. And then I can mentally tell myself, I'll get to it at some point. And so like the idea of a one-shot is something that I'll play the one-shots, I'll get a few in there, and I'll be like, oh, this is fun, I'll pull out of here and there. And then at a certain point, maybe I'll actually sit down, deep dive into the campaign. But at the same time, there are others who will be like, well, I feel like all these guest writing talent that you're bringing to the table, they're just doing these one-shot adventures, and I want the campaign. So I think interweaving them, if you can do that, is a great idea. But
does make you wonder how many Gloomhaven boards are out there that just have 4 stickers on them.
I do wonder. I do wonder indeed. So one of my favorite moments of watching, I remember I saw Tom Vassell at a live Q&A, something like that, and he said, they just announced Frosthaven. Everyone raise your hand if you're getting Frosthaven. And like almost everyone's hands went up. And they're like, raise your hand if you've completed Gloomhaven. And like 7 hands went up. It was like it was amazing to watch. But so speaking of the writing talent, so this is one of the things that was and is a concern for me as to whether Bardsung is the right game for me, which is I'm seeing 2 things that are combining together at once. balance. I'm seeing a huge focus on accessibility, both in terms of the setup as well as, like, I mean, you've done a great job with the icons, the visual aspect. You're not so text heavy. You have enough text that there's like fun, interesting things, while also focusing a lot on icon simplicity, a very accessible system. And then you throw, which again, that to me, that's all a good thing. I like accessibility. There's a place and there's a time and place for complicated, heavy stats and everything else, and there's a time for accessibility. But then the second thing that has me worried for myself, just again, not whether Bardsung is the right game for someone, just whether it's right for me, is I'm seeing all this writing talent being brought to the table, like a ton of writing talent. And I'm wondering, who is the target audience for Bardsung? Is it more RPG? Is it more board people who've played Descent, Gloomhaven, whatnot? Is it more bringing people into the fold in general from outside? Like, is like this degree of writing talent, does it come at the cost of the system that Bardsung is itself?
No, I think it underpins it, and I think it supports it and pushes it forward. I think. Oh, and I know for a fact that we deliberately, when we look to position products, we try not to over compartmentalize ourselves and say this is a game just for this type of person. We did an exercise recently where we took some of the, you might have seen it, some of the persona research that they did for Magic the Gathering. We've got access to a few other kind of more video game orientated breakdowns of different, demographics and different types of people who play games. And we were looking and talking about what do they look like and how can we use them in to shape our development better? Because I think we do a lot of these things instinctively. So what does that actually look like when we try and put it into a process? And what was quite fun was taking a really kind of polarized persona and then putting a name against it of either one of us in the dev team or someone that we know from one of the communities that we play games with regularly. And you would say that and everyone would laugh and kind of go, oh yeah, Jamie's super competitive. God, that guy. But then you kind of go, yeah, but hold on. He does also quite like, this aspect and this aspect. And he's also a little bit this as well. And it really drives home that we are all nuanced personas. We're not single personas. So if we just make a game just for one thing, I think we're gonna drop the ball, not only for that one demographic that we do target, but all the others that we choose to leave behind. So Bardsung needs to have aspects that will appeal to more than just a single demographic or a single target persona. Now that is the other end of the spectrum. If we try and please everyone, we'll end up pleasing no one. So we do need to be quite focused in what we want to do. So I will point to games that we have done in the past as a demonstration of our intent with regard to Bardsung. So if you look at Guild Ball, you run, you kick, you use abilities, right? Yeah. I can teach you how to play Guild Ball in less than 10 minutes, right? But you will spend the next 5 years of your life trying to find the perfect team and the perfect way to play and the perfect, and have the perfect scoring runs, because the depth is the number of interactions and the way the game reacts to the way that you play the game. And the fact that, and the same with God Tier, it does exactly the same thing. I can teach you how to play that in 5 minutes or less, but it also has that huge depth underneath it. Now, the beautiful thing about the depth is it's entirely scalable with your ability and your level of devotion to that game. So what we saw with Guild Ball and what we're seeing with God Tier is people who invest a lot of time will discover more and more depth, more and more ways for the different component parts to interact with each other. So it's a bit like Tony Hawk's on the PlayStation, right? Yeah. We've given you a ramp, a bank, and a ledge. Now, if you're a creative Tony Hawk's player, you're going to spend an hour just jamming on that stuff, right? Yeah. Or if you're just a casual player, you might pop a couple of volleys, do a couple of grinds, and then you're off looking for something else. So we just need to put the ledge and the lip and the and the rail in there, and that's really what we're doing. It's really immediately accessible what the core component parts are. If that's your level of experience or your level of intent for the project, you will find a great experience and have a lot of fun. But if you are in that kind of gaming group that really wants to get into the nuts and bolts, look for the efficiencies, look for the move economy, try and understand the economies behind how actions translate into fate and how fate translates into results. Start working with that stuff. Start looking at the positioning on the board. And when we show you the boss fight, you'll start understanding the multi-layer of there is positioning on the board, there is positioning on the marching order that you now need to rationalize. There's acres of depth to play this game to an excellent level, using the word excellent, advisedly. So it's really there to be a brilliant onboarding point for people who watch shows like Crit Role, or they've heard about D&D, or they've looked at Gloomhaven and thought, God, that's quite meaty, or Descent probably actually is a little bit closer to kind of the level of accessibility that we want to hit, that kind of feel. But once they get in, they then discover a world that allows them to tell their own stories, a world that or a game that gives them the opportunity to choose their own path and build their dungeons out and create stories as they go through, and really sense and feel that they are in the dungeon and they are making the right choices, and it will have an impact in the game. Well, if you get excited about that, then that game is for you as well. And then skill level, it'll give you what you want out of it. So bear in mind, Sherwin and I and Fraser, who are the three key design team on this, are really heavy tournament level wargamers.
Gotcha.
We still find endless amounts of conversation and interest in playing Bardsung, and we are approaching it from that kind of mindset.
So everything you're saying to a degree lends itself to a relevant question, which I don't think I've seen. It could be you've addressed it already, but like, how does this scale in terms of difficulty? Meaning, in terms of what options have you done to ensure that people are not either crushing through it or just struggling heavily and unable to make progress?
So an interesting thing that, if I can quickly jump in, Matt, for
do it.
So I think one of the things that we've perfected with some of our games earlier on, some of our licensed games, is very much this idea of an onboarding ramp, i.e. a tutorial system through actual reading a rule book and actually progressing through. So it's something where we first did it with Resident Evil 2, but it was really something where we wanted to say, we know that our audience isn't going to immediately start a skill cap where they are an experienced tournament level gamer, or they do have, they have played a whole bunch of different tabletop games or whatever else. We want people to be able to pick up that rule book. Okay, I've learned the basics. I can now fight, a couple of hobgoblins. I know how to take my turn. I know how the marching order works or whatever else.
Sure.
Okay, so I finished that adventure. Now I can move on to the next one or whatever else. But what happens with that is you slowly layer in complexity, you slowly layer in the difficulty, you slowly introduce new concepts to players so they're not overwhelmed. And by the time they've kind of, sort of 3 or 4 encounters in, at this point they're kind of, okay, so now I really know how this works, and I'm actually starting to level up, so I'm not thrown in the deep end every time. And when you start looking at sort of how the difficulty ramp, obviously we're starting to increase the difficulty of enemies at that point as well, so people aren't then overwhelmed. So, for example, you will find very, very basic grunts, same as our tutorial on Tabletopia has at the moment. If you look at each one of those individual enemies, they're really there to introduce a basic concept. The Brigand is your very starter enemy. It's very, very simple. The Raider has introduced a range attack and a different behavior type. The Brute introduces a flipped card, so you can actually do that, and you can understand how the armor break system works, for example. If we go a little bit further on, the Butcher, which isn't in the tutorial, but the Butcher actually has a grudge token, so when you defeat it, it gives it to another player. That changes around how it targets people when you meet it again, for example. Or the Reaver is there to kind of introduce how it can change the effects, change the rule behavior of how a grunt works, and actually sort of chase you down with other things, and really sort of start to manipulate the board in other ways. It's something where we introduce all of these different concepts slowly, so that way people don't get overwhelmed, but also we want it to be something where people don't just simply crush through a dungeon. They don't just start off and go, you know what, I know very, very quickly how to do this, so I can blast through, and I'm unstoppable, and nothing can stop me, nothing can touch me to that certain level. We think a lot about how players are going to earn XP as they go through, how they're going to gain new abilities. And one of the best things is obviously what we want to encourage with people is, if you want to be that person who says, you know what, I am playing Nightfeather, and Nightfeather has, Nightfeather follows the Path of Shadows, and I'm not really sure how to play these sort of games or whatever else. I'll just keep taking cards from Path of Shadows. Great. As you upgrade, then Nightfeather is intimately, is extremely well geared to actually use those abilities, and that won't ever get you into too much problem. There's no analysis paralysis. If by comparison you're someone who wants to break open the box, look through every single different ability and start thinking, if I chain this off of this, if I pick up Weapon Master from the Path of Blood deck, well, suddenly that means that Nightfeather is much more efficient at killing stuff. I don't really mind that I might not be able to get X, Y, Z as a result, but that's fine. This is how I want to skew my player, then you can do. But at the same time, the best part for me of a lot of these games, and something we've tried to introduce, is this part where players should talk to each other around the table. They should sort of start to gear up their characters in relation to it. When you're really building your character, you're building a party of people. You're sort of really looking at what toolbox, abilities you need to be able to bring to that. If everyone is an individual, if you kind of have Night Feather says, well, you know what, I'm going to be a killing machine, and then everyone else does the same thing, but no one wants to worry about healing, then you're not going to get very far. So you do have to work together in tandem to actually really, or as a party, as a group, to kind of really make that happen. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts that I can throw into Bardsung. Just quickly circling all the way back to when Matt was talking about what makes this distinctive, is its player interaction and cooperation. It's something where we wanted positioning on the table to be super important. We wanted it to be something where, enemies give you an intelligent decision to make, or a meaningful decision to make when they're attacking you. It's not as simple as I just grab X amount of models, shove them, move them into a zone, and then suddenly start rolling a fistful of dice. There's some points about that. And I think difficulty in terms of learning that, we have a slow onboarding system, and in terms of raw game difficulty, I think that's also something which players very quickly find the level that they want to play at as they go through. And I think that generally tends to balance it out quite nicely.
Perfect. And I have 2 more questions. I think it was 2. I need to remember what the last one was. I had a second ago. Oh, yes. First of all, can players jump in and out of the campaign?
Go on, Matt,
Yeah. So one of the things that quite frankly is less locked down, but is something that Sho and I have talked about quite a bit, is I like the idea of pre-gen characters. And one of the ways that we control the balance of the game as you go through is identifying what we think the amount of XP a hero should have in order to take on a particular adventure.
Sure.
So if let's say the 3 of us are playing and we're part way through our campaign, we're at like a mid-level point in the campaign, and our friend Dave wants to come along and just play for a one-shot, I think we either help him tool a character to that number of XP, and it will say on the adventure this is 15 XP or higher, right? So he'll have 15 XP to spend, or go to Steamforged.com and download a pre-gen at that particular level, and you can just print that out, stick it down, that becomes your dashboard, and you're off and playing. So that's kind of where we're going to go in terms of people being able to drop in and out. And because each encounter is effectively self-contained gameplay, the results of which have an impact on the campaign, but the actual gameplay itself is more self-contained. Dave can come in and join in our fun, play with us through a few different encounters, maybe even an entire adventure, and then he can go wandering off into the Lost Citadel, on his own adventures, and we carry on our story, and it won't feel weird at all.
As a slight statement as well, it's something where the actual cards themselves, the event cards that you're pulling, I know you said you were reading the rulebook previous.
Yeah.
So you pull them out, you kind of have different codes which scales the amount of enemies up and down according to how many players there are. So Dave, in our example, kind of turns up for a few of our encounters. Then there's just a few more enemies to fight against, so the game actually bounces up to that. If Dave then drops out, then that's great. We're just using a different band of enemies effectively for what that is.
Excellent. And then one last question, which is for the Lost Levels expansion. What does that add to the gameplay? It adds new foes, it adds new enemies, but what does it add? Any new mechanics? Does it take place along with the game? Does it take place after the campaign?
So it's designed to I can't show and stop me if I'm going too far with the story, but we all know that there's a greater demon in the box set, and we all know
you can't tell them about the great demon. You can't tell them, it's a spoiler.
I'm going to tell you everything because, look, at the end of the day, it's how you play the game. But so if we were looking at the movie trailer for Bardsung, you would see a band of innocent adventurers being asked to go and deal with a hobgoblin incursion problem, and then falling into a cascading nightmare of hobgoblins and bugbears who are being attacked by Durgar because Durgar have tunneled in and they're doing something nefarious, and then the Durgar discover something deep below hidden magic or a hidden kind of cache of terrible weapons, and what they've decided to do, because it makes perfect sense, is summon a greater demon to help them in their regard. And the movie ends in a cataclysmic CGI kind of fight against this massive demon, right? Let's say that's the route you choose to go down. Well, the Lost Levels is
It's
the next
redacted.
bit.
It's entirely redacted at this point.
It's the next bit.
The best way I can describe it in the way that is completely and totally spoiler free is if you think, and I'll go back to Resident Evil again just because I think it's a really useful one.
Sure.
At the start of the game, you land and you are effectively attacked by a bunch of zombie dogs, and then you break into the nearby mansion and there's zombies, and you have no idea why the zombies are there.
Okay.
You're just trying to work it out. As you go through, you sort of, you find diaries, you find, kind of notes, bloodstained notes or whatever, and you find a few different clues and different details and so on.
Bugbears.
Yeah, exactly. And the odd bugbear. And you start to uncover a story and you start to understand what is actually happening here and why that is. The Lost Levels, the best way I can describe it is if your viewers are familiar with Resident Evil, it's like when you get to the labs underneath the mansion, is the best way to describe that. You're at that point, you're really going to discover what's going on with, a lot of the narrative side of things and a lot of the backstory and lore around these things.
Cool.
It's the next bit of the story, basically. It's where do you go from there?
And roughly how many hours of content, if you know that yet? Like, I know that base game's 50 hours.
It's not going to be 50 hours, no.
I
It's
assume.
probably, I think probably in the order of sort of 20 hours, I would have thought, 15 to 20 hours, something like that.
Perfect. Okay,
Yeah.
So that's basically everything. Let's wrap this part up now, and we can figure out what we're doing after this. But basically, Matt and Sherwin, thank you so much for hopping on, for answering any questions. Is there anything else you want to specifically say, mention, or whatnot before we wrap up?
I think the only thing that I want to do is slightly poke a mild bit of fun at you and say there was only one gameplay expansion.
There's only okay. So that part, I'll agree. You're right. I was right about the total all-in numbers, but I didn't realize how many gameplay expansions there were. I made that mistake.
Right.
Yes.
So look, at the end of the day, we are a business and we need to make money, but we do recognize, especially in this year, but also the way gamers like to spread their love across multiple companies, that giving those people who want everything
Sure.
an opportunity to have everything, and those people who want to have the core gameplay experience, they can do that in their own way as well, and not
100%.
necessarily have all the other kind of bells and whistles that are kind of cool, but you've got to trim your budget to suit your
For
cloth.
sure, and that's why. I mean, the truth is, I should ask it just so I can answer for people who aren't you and I. But that's why one of the questions I didn't ask, because I know the answer, is a frequent complaint you'll see on Kickstarters, including this one as well, is that base game comes with 66 miniatures plus another 20 in the stretch goals, and it's $99. It's coming close to $1 per miniature, possibly in that range by the time you're done. And then we have the expansion, which is $65 for 22 miniatures, which is like $3 a miniature. And people are like, why is the content so expensive? And the answer is because that is the nature of having, when you have an add-on, you have to pay for all those molds, you have to pay for all the research, and you're distributing all those costs among far fewer people who are buying it. I have no.
That's the key. That's the absolute key. Is you will never sell as many expansions as you do core games. It's just maths, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing that we need to bear in mind when we look at the relative value proposition of an expansion versus a core game.
100%. I never give any campaign a hard time about the expansion being more expensive relatively to the core content. It is the nature of how these things work. And the truth, I only asked it because you brought up that aspect, but I should have asked it for those that don't know that. But in any case, so that's basically everything. Thank you so much, Sharon and Matt, and to everyone else, we'll see you in a minute. And so that's basically it. It was an absolute pleasure talking to Matt and Sherwin. This is the first time I've actually been able to communicate directly with Steamforged. They were nice enough to reach out to me directly based on my prior videos. But basically, I want to be clear here. I am backing Bardsung. I don't know if you've watched the gameplay yet, or if you're going to watch the gameplay, but I want to be very clear here that my opinion has not shifted dramatically. It is kind of where I was to begin with, which is Bardsung looks appealing. It looks accessible. It potentially will be a great game for my collection, but there's a reason why I chose to film this video by having all these guys next to me, which is it is fighting for heavily coveted shelf space, and there's too many of these games. And so Bardsung, the reason I'm choosing to Bardsung is going to be a combination of a few things. Now, to begin with, I made this decision before touching the gameplay. We had the interview, then the gameplay, so I made this decision to actually decide to back it before touching the gameplay. The gameplay did solidify it for me. And so the decision comes down ultimately to the fact that it's something I've talked about before. If a game will hold its value, and it's something that you're interested in, and assuming you are in a place where you can actually sell the game, then why not get it? And that's going to be very much be where I ended up. Bardsung looks interesting. I am pulled in by, overall I like the miniature design, some more than others. I particularly like the Lost Level expansion. I love some of these stretch goals they've had, that shark character. I love the shark character. I find it interesting. I always tend to like the characters that people find off-putting. I don't know. Either way, but I like a lot of these stretch goals, the additional characters they're adding, the additional bosses, roaming monsters, all that stuff. The image they released an image of the game trays and how it will kind of look in the box, and it looks great. It's a concept piece, so take it as a grain of salt. They've added a lot of, extras that are completely unnecessary but will add to your immersion, some scenery, some stuff. They dropped the all-in pledge today, and I think it was $270. I'm going by memory here, but they dropped the all-in pledge. I sadly will probably go for the all-in unless I can piece it out in a way that makes more sense for me personally, but I'll probably end up going for the all-in pledge. I will for sure be getting the main box and the Lost Levels expansion. But ultimately, the main reason I'll be back in the game is the combination of interest and holding its value. As far as my review of the game, this is not a review of the game. I played a singular boss battle while jumping in, barely knowing what was going on. And so my overall opinion from that boss battle is it neither pushed me towards nor pushed me away from the game. That's not entirely true. It pushed me a little bit towards the game. It pushed me a little bit towards the game in the sense that I kind of want to build up my own character now. I kind of want to build out my own stats and feel that progression for myself. I want to see the interweaving aspects of how the characters can work together to get things done. For myself, the actual gameplay, it was a boss battle. It wasn't the typical exploration, so if you've already seen gameplay, by the way, this is going to be different. This is not going to be the typical gameplay they've had until now. It's a boss level instead, so very, very different feel to what's going on there. But ultimately, the actual gameplay itself felt fairly scripted. Not totally scripted, but fairly scripted. There were limited options you could actually take as you encountered the boss. The boss would zip around from different areas of the little dungeon, running around, pushing you, knocking you out of the way, and then each turn I would try to take an attack and then use one of my alternate abilities to potentially do something else. So the gameplay itself didn't heavily push me towards Bardsung, but it pushed me towards the promise of Bardsung. Like I said already, I want to build out my character. I want to develop these skills and abilities they have access to. I want to adjust for their skill trees, their stats, and try to figure out what is the best combination of things that will make it work. The gameplay was fine. It wasn't bad. It was fine. But it also did not truly pull me in, but I didn't expect it to. Boss battles in general are always a different beast to me. They're always a different beast. They're always a different thing in terms of what I actually look for out of a game. That aspect of going back and forth, rolling dice, trying to hit. I did want a little more agency in the level and degree of choice I had during that encounter. But like I said already, there was agency and there was choice already. And that's all with me really having no clue what I was doing, not building up my character, and not really knowing the other characters on the board and how we could work together as a team to win. So overall, the combination of a good value, a game that interests me, and a gameplay experience that didn't push me away and pulled me a drop closer towards seeing more of Bardsung. This is not a heavy, giant stamp of approval in Bardsung's favor. If you are on the fence, as I have been, you may still be on the fence. But this whole process pushed me over the fence, and I am currently backing Bardsung. Until next time, I am Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co. Don't forget to check out the gameplay video if you want to see heavily unedited footage of me just wandering around trying to figure out what I'm doing. Well, that is a treat as always. Until next time, have a good one.